Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Critical Theory. It's a podcast that's part of the New Books Network. On this episode, I'm talking to Shai Dromi and Samuel Stabler about moral minefields, how sociologists debate good science. So welcome to the podcast.
Hey,
Thank you.
welcome. Thanks for having us.
This is a fantastic book. It's incredibly interesting. I think it speaks directly to this moment we found ourselves, not just actually in sociology, but across the social sciences. And I think it's going to be quite important, actually, not just in the States, where you've drawn lots of your examples from, but also actually more globally for sociology and social science. And I guess the place to start with the book is I mean, the obvious question is like, why have you written it? But I'm really interested in why have you written a book about morality and sociology kind of right now? Why at this moment?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, thanks again for having us on, Dave. Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting you bring up this cross-Atlantic kind of connection because in part the book took shape actually like on an engagement. One of our advisors was working hard on trying to bring critical realism to America. Uh and so in some ways the book was like, somewhat inspired by that. But, the broader, kind of more obvious answers are that, increasingly sociologists talk about their work as justice oriented. So in America, right, there have been these presidential addresses at the ASA by Alden Morris and Mary Romero and others that call for sociology to be explicitly political or activist in its orientation. And yeah, across the pond, you see this, I think, with a lot of the critical realism debates, but also some of the other debates about, just kind of morality and social science more broadly. Um, and then, you know, this has led to and kind of was shaped, I think, also by me and Shai in grad school, right? Which was, this question of, what kind of discipline is sociology going to be? What kind of sociologists are we going to be? I mean, I think you were saying before we got on, like the book seems very collaborative, and it is. It's a long format kind of discussion between me and Shai about what is this thing that we are now committing our lives to. And then I think last, that there were these huge public facing controversies which kept kind of wrangling the discipline and, kind of wrangle the discipline over and over again. So people would have these debates. It would become very clear that, on the right, there would be this whole debate about how social science has lost its bias. And on the left, there would be all these arguments about how social science needs to be even more political, that, these are kind of proof that the social sciences have political impact and therefore need to be taken seriously. And our book, and I think the project was really stemmed from this idea that, you know, good social science is somehow a balance. It's somehow combining these different elements so that, your work speaks both publicly and scientifically, that it is both valid and true and morally worthy. I don't know, Shai, what do you say?
No, I agree. I mean, we both got our PhDs at a time where these conversations were just at the fore, and part of it is because the handbook of the sociology of morality had come out in 2013, edited by Steve Vasey and Steve Hitlin. And I think it really sparked kind of an efflorescence of work on morality in sociology that I think was just cresting when we really got into conversations about this book.
I'm quite interested to know how you actually cut into these debates. I think Sam's given a really good overview of, or a kind of introduction to the kind of contours of where the debates are and what individual controversies and interventions have kind of driven the resurgence of interest in morality in sociology and in social science. But obviously, books need frameworks, they need approaches, and I'm interested to know what your sort of, I guess, kind of pragmatist approach is in the book.
Yeah. So I think that two of our main points is that sociologists, just like everyone else, are critical and generally aware actors in a sense that they can understand broad, abstract questions of morality, that they have the critical capacity to critique others, others' work, others' conduct, and so on, and that this is in a way not dependent on their status in the discipline, on their background, and so on. That this, at the end of the day, all of us have some tools to criticize others, and we this kind of brought us into the sociology of Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, what's normally referred to as the sociology of critique. As well as to cultural sociology that Michel Amont and Jeff Alexander exemplify, that really emphasizes creativity and action in thinking through conundrums about what's good to do, what's right to do, and so on. And our approach has been to really follow sociologists' meta commentary. Their commentary about why are we doing the research that we're doing, and then see what sort of moral logics they use. How do they justify what they're doing as contributing, to sociology, but also to society, and what sort of cultural tools they develop in the process.
I'm interested to know, I guess, and we're going to come on to these individual, what would we call them, like kind of case studies of different bits of sociology, different controversies, different subfields, but also, as you've kind of outlined, the sense that sociologists have particular frameworks, approaches, orientations, comes through really strongly at the start of the book when you talk about moral repertoires. And you've got various kind of examples of different moral repertoires that sociologists might use. And maybe I'll come to you on this, Sam. I'm interested to know, I guess, both some examples of them, but also where this idea of a moral repertoire kind of extends or fits in to what Shai was saying about the kind of pragmatist Boltanski Thévenot.
Yeah. So the moral repertoire language we draw a lot from Michel Amont's work, right, who builds on this broader notion of kind of culture and repertoires as a means of thinking about culture. So Lamont calls repertoires kind of the supply side of culture, right? They provide individuals with certain logics, certain codes, certain terms, certain ways of behaving that allow to individuals to act in a culturally kind of meaningful way. And so, for our purposes, when we think about, what is a moral repertoire and what are these repertoires, they are the situations that we kind of agree on as cultural actors are valid as moral causes. And I think one of the key points of our book is that the moral repertoires are not, we don't claim to opine or judge on whether the work that people claim is moral actually is moral. We're much more interested in actually how people claim what they're doing is moral and whether or not other people find ways to challenge them or say it's worthwhile. So, we can imagine, I think of a friend of mine who teaches environmental sociology was telling me the class had been going well, and had been going so well that the students were now arguing with each other over who had the more ecologically friendly water bottle. Right. and what I would tell you is that they had learned a new set of moral repertoires about what water bottles are good and why they're good, and learning to apply them in sort of new ways. Now, whether any of these kids are morally superior, I mean, I doubt it, right? Like they're just kind of applying these new moral rhetorics in a way that's sociologically worth noticing. And Shai and I think are try to remain very agnostic about whether or not what people say is good and the good of their research actually is good, as much as to say this is a core part of how sociologists talk to one another. And that when you talk to sociologists about what they do, it's almost taken for granted that if you study inequality, you want inequality to go away. That if you study, social erasure, that what you want to do is bring those erased people back into the conversation. That the way we do sociology and talk about sociology, besides all the arguments we have about standard errors and methodological technology and big data and all that other stuff, involves some very core moral commitments. And Shai and I ironically found as graduate students that senior faculty often didn't consider it this way. So we once emailed a demographer to be on an early panel related to this topic. And they wrote back and they said, no, thank you. I thought this email was about mortality, not morality. I don't feel myself to be an expert in morality in any way. I am an expert in mortality. And that was kind of it. And I was like, I mean, how can you not think about mortality, death, as a moral issue, as an issue with moral force? And so part of the early way we talked about the book was trying to get these repertoires more out in the open, more obvious, more clear kind of. And so that's why we focus, like Shai said, on meta commentary, scholars talking about their research, right? Because this is one of the few times they kind of openly discuss, why is this a worthwhile activity? And when you study society, you're supposed to say you're going to help society, right? That's the goal.
And I will just,
I mean,
sorry. I will just add that one of the retorts that we've gotten at various points is like, oh, that's all fair, that's all nice, but I actually just want to do facts. I just want to do value neutral sociology, and for us that is also a moral repertoire, right? Because and we're following up on decades of feminist theorizing on this, right? Donna Haraway, Dorothy Smith, right, who showed us that actually saying, oh, I'm just objective or I just want to do facts is itself a value-laden statement, right? So one of the things that we want to bring to light is that that's also, we're not saying that people are less objective or more objective, but we're saying that they're using objectivity in debates as a moral repertoire on its own.
And it's really great actually, and just picking up on that point of all positions have some element of moral repertoire in them. The book I think really brings to life, partly because you really get the sense that you two have kind of lived the experience of these moral repertoires, on panels, on at conferences, on I guess the sort of the sharp end of reviews coming back on papers and stuff like this. But you do get the sense from the book of these are not abstract theorizations. There are examples of precisely the kind of language you would expect to see from, say, a reviewer or someone at a conference, drawing on one of these moral repertoires. And I think the way, to kind of make these things concrete for the listeners is to dip into the various examples that the book has got. You talk quite early on about debates and controversies in the sociology of religion. The book moves on to talk about things like race, and then there are questions of cosmopolitanism, gender, fertility, these kind of things. And maybe we'll take each of these in turn and sort of dip into them in a way that kind of really brings the book to life and makes real the moral repertoires that you've introduced already. So I suppose a kind of a quick question is, what's gone on in the sociology of religion over the past, say, 50 years? But the book still try and give a sense of how sociology of religion has debated whether we are a more or less kind of secular society and where different frames have kind of been applied to that. So how does this play out with the sociology of religion?
Yeah, so the sociology of religion chapter, it's kind of it's our kind of proto chapter, right? It has all the rest of the chapters are kind of structured by how it works, and it's really about religion. And it, like the rest of the chapters, it kind of does. Yeah, it's like a short history of recent events in the sociology of religion, right? In a very kind of schematic, thematized way, right? And so the story we pick up on is really like this story that animated my interest in sociology early on, was this question of secularization, right? Is secularization happening? Is the world becoming less and less religious? And whatever, I was raised by new age people in the Pacific Northwest who would take me to weird bookstores, and like as a kid, I always wondered about this. And then, eventually one day I stumbled into a sociology of religion class. And sure enough, I learned that there was this growing realization in the literature, starting from the 60s, of the New Age movements and the new religiosity. And, not just that, but also the growth in massive growth in evangelical Christianity in America throughout the 70s and the 80s, right? And this question of, well, is religion really dying or is it really growing? And increasingly, at some point starting in the 70s or 80s, there becomes this realization that while Weber and Marx and all these classic sociological theorists had told you that religion was doomed forever, that religion seems to persist and it seems to be quite lively. Christians find new ways to come up with new Christianity that's quite exciting and gains lots of followers. So too with other religious streams, new religious movements, but also religious movements that are non-traditional for certain environments, right? And so, I started studying this and getting really into this, and really, I think what we see over the past 50 years is this shift in the repertoire, right? Where the field has grown in part by, kind of adopting different stances to the question of secularization. And so probably the most famous and the loudest is what we call the rational choice approach to religion. This is an approach to religion that thinks about believers really as a kind of limited good that different churches compete over. It's very shaped by kind of American models and takes the idea of the separation of church and state as a kind of metaphor for a market economy. So in the same way, free market economists say we need to get the state out of government. What the religious economies models people say is, well, when the United States, disestablished religion, this led to a giant transformation of how religious occur. There's a opening of the market, and these theorists are kind of liberal in the classic sense, right? They believe that free religion is good for civic equality because it leads to religious competition, religious innovation, religious engagement, religious involvement. And this is really like, the first kind of inklings I had of, how the scholarship in religion was adapting to the question of secularization. One argument was to say, well, actually, there is a lot of religion out there in the world. Secularization isn't happening the way they tell you it is. In fact, there are these groups who are innovating and competing. And for that to happen, we have to do things like defend religious liberty. We have to defend religious freedom, and we have to ensure that religious groups are allowed to compete equally. This was a very powerful and pervasive argument in the sociology of religion, but comparative historical sociologists quickly kind of called a foul. And so that's kind of our second group. Our second group of scholars were a bunch of critics, people in the comparative historical mode, who first of all, pointed to the fact that the United States wasn't the only place to disestablish religion, and in lots of those places, religious competition didn't change in the same way or the same shape, right? We didn't see these massive innovations, for instance, in Europe once religious toleration was instituted. But more broadly, that this approach was kind of a little parochial, right? That this approach, while it used the United States as a key case example, it often overreached by trying to force everything into the US model, by trying to make that model kind of the core of all things. And so these theorists really emphasized what we call the efficiency repertoire. This kind of stands in some ways for what we think of as kind of the scientific repertoire, right? They kind of said, well, you need to think about all the possible cases. You need to include all the possible cases. So we can't just talk about religious regulation and its effect on religious change and religious innovation by looking at the US. We have to look at all the countries across all time and all space. And that conversation really kind of dug its heels in to the point where, there's just these like long-standing debates in the sociology of religion between these kind of civic-minded liberals who are interested in the rational choice model and these kind of scientifically oriented comparative historical sociologists who said, no, what we need to do is be comparing religious models in a way that allows us to understand change in a new way. And really, like when Shai and I both started, because we both work on religion, when we started working on religion, this kind of third era sort of had started to take fold. And so we kind of describe this in the book as what we call the marketability repertoire. A whole generation of theorists kind of started saying, is religion here to stay or not, is a question that we've dug into the ground. We can't get further on this question without thinking about new and more interesting ways of talking about religion. So one of these avenues was the lived religion approach, which was, really strong amongst ethnographers and cultural sociologists. And so Shai and I were both kind of tuned into that. But we also saw this in a shift in, some of these rational choice modelers, for instance, started speaking openly and explicitly about the need to clearly define religion in the hopes of acquiring research funding and attention. And so we see, kind of whole new streams in the sociology of religion emerge. The sociology of religious nationalism has become, quite a cottage industry in recent years. And in part, that's because people have kind of said, those researchers specifically said, the field of sociology of religion doesn't need to be oriented around this question of, is religion here to stay or is it going? But rather, what religion do we have now and what does that mean for our society? And so, that's kind of the first glance you get. And what Shai and I kind of tell you is that each one of these maneuvers, each one of these waves is exemplary of a different kind of maneuver. So the rational choice people kind of said, you were told secularization, but that's all a lie. We need to get rid of that. We call that delegitimization, right? Where one theory is destroyed in the name of another. Then we'd say the efficiency people who come next, these are reformers. They say, well, the harsh critics are pretty good, but they need to kind of get, kind of understand that the world's bigger than just their criticism. And the last group of people we call reconstitutionalists. They take fields that are diametrically opposed, where it seems like we've hit some sort of dead end, and find a new morality that says we can research this stuff for a different reason. In this case, that it brings research funds, that it's of interest to people outside of our parochial field, right? And each one of these we try to explore in different chapters with different case studies, but this one kind of serves as our first kind of foray into it. And as with the rest of the chapters, many of these are kind of highly stylized, but the point is to highlight that there's clear and open discussion during things like annual meetings, paper topics, paper sessions, annual review articles, where people say, this is what the field should be doing, and this is how it contributes to a good society, right? One wave says, we are sociologists of religion. The way we contribute to the good society is by promoting religious freedom and creating information and knowledge about that and its effects on religious change. The next group says, no. Good sociology of religion helps a society by producing facts that are efficient, that are comparative, that are clearly organized, that are highly rigorous and scientific. And the last group says, no. We should stop telling the society what makes good sociology of religion, and we should start trying to listen to them. We should start trying to make work that appeals to others, that fits into our current cultural climate and debates.
I mean, that's a fantastic overview, both of the field, but also of how you, I guess, take these kind of meta positions and synthesize them to give a sense of where the moral commitments come in. There are various other sort of examples we could get into through the book, but I think I want to concentrate on two, because I think they're really good examples of both how the book goes beyond just kind of describing what's been going on with moral position taking, and actually tries to say there are possibly kind of ways forward, and they're in the chapter on race, and then on the chapter on gender and fertility. With the chapter on race, and maybe Shai, I'll come to you on this one. One of the things that I found most interesting was you take what is an incredibly kind of controversial and in some cases incredibly sort of depressing field or subfield thinking about racial inequalities, and try and say how that field has really actually given rise to kind of new forms of solidarity as a result of the kind of moral positions, but also the critique of some of the kind of big names in that field. And I'm interested to know precisely about that kind of sense of how solidarity gets built out of controversies, and how I guess kind of moral repertoires can really move a field forward, and possibly create something kind of positive from controversial positions.
Yeah, absolutely. So we decided to devote a chapter to this because we were really struck by the various claims made normally by conservative commentators that academia is just too PC and too I don't know, afraid to really research controversial topics, right? And that's a debate that came up around Charles Murray's book The Bell Curve, right, which make claims about intelligence being tied to race and genetics, and so on, and kind of with the argument being made that academia is just too PC to even consider that, and we wanted to show that actually, like, no, that's 100% not true. Um, that academia does develop areas that we refer to as no-go zones, right? Areas where there's heightened sensitivities, where certain research practices are deemed particularly harmful and like in a way excluded from the discipline. But that doesn't mean that we don't do research on controversial topics, such as the race and genetics, or the culture of poverty. Various studies, right? Studies that have traditionally been very controversial due to kind of blaming the victim, blaming poor people for, in a way, being poor. But what we're trying to show is that scholars have engaged in very nuanced ways about thinking about, okay, what is the moral harm in accepting assumptions about, let's say, the culture of underserved communities, kind of promoting poverty. Um, what are the moral harms, and what are ways in which we can conduct research on those topics in an acceptable ways. And then, as you mentioned, one of the ways that we're showing is kind of building solidarity and community around the engagement with these topics. And we see this work in special issues and symposia, in places where social scientists are invited to kind of revisit a controversial topic and then reimagine how research can be conducted in these realms in a new way. So, for example, edited volumes by Mario Small and Catherine Newman, and an edited on guest AJS issue by Peter Bierman, all kind of, and others, just invited scholars to bring together areas that don't normally talk to each other, in part because of the historical sensitivity around engaging with these topics, and really trying to figure out, so what are ways to advance in this field? What are ways to devise research on underserved communities that looks at that obviously, like, engages with cultural questions, but at the same time does not reduce the poverty to simply a cultural phenomenon. So, for example, work like Fred Ware's research on payday loans, right, which helps us kind of understand how racialized communities negotiate their socioeconomic hardships without making the mistake of seeing the culture their poverty emerging from their culture, and others. So these are some of the examples of attempts to kind of rethink and bring together areas in a new way to kind of address a topic that, yes, has been very sensitive, but at the same time can be explored in new ways that actually that actually not only circumvent the moral problem, but actually help resolve the real world issues that they address.
I mean, part of what you described there, this comes up more explicitly later in the book is the idea of the kind of reconstitution of a field or an area of study. And Sam, maybe you can talk me through this, but the example you've got is debates over fertility and its relationship to work choices, to gender, and I guess kind of more broadly actually to various sort of moral positions related to things like choices to start families, choices to go to work, this kind of thing. And the reconstitution of a field, I was sort of taken with that term, partially because it's one of the sort of formal terms you use, but it also struck me that in some ways many of the chapters are talking about attempts to kind of almost refound areas of study, and the discussion of gender, fertility, and work is an example of maybe where this reconstitution has been, I suppose, kind of successful. So what's the sort of the story there, Sam?
Yeah, so when we talk about reconstitution, yeah, I mean, I think you're right to pick up, kind of the larger theme, and this is something hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later, is, this question of pluralism, right? We all have these different values of how we do social science, and then, there are these different moves to, kind of refound or reform or challenge the existing moral frameworks of what we do. And reconstitution, yeah, these are these efforts where there's usually a deadlock situation, kind of two morally opposed arguments are stuck, and somebody comes along, some group of researchers usually, and finds a new way of thinking about how do we proceed going forward. And so we focus on the field of demographic research, and particularly its shift over the past 50 to 100 years or so. And we focus on two different kinds of questions. So one is about breastfeeding outcomes and the history of breastfeeding research. If you're interested in that, you should check it out in the book. What I'll talk to you about a little bit is these questions about fertility intention. So one of the things demographic research does early on in the 20th century is start asking questions about how many children you intend to have over the course of your lifetime. And this is seen as a new way of thinking about culture and demographic measurement, right? Up until, starting with Malthus, like the main kind of moral metaphor for demography is the human as beast in some ways, right? And starting in the turn of the 20th century, partially, because of the changing cultural climate, the Sangerites and the birth control movement is on the rise. We start seeing questions about, how many kids do you actually want to have? How will you control your fertility? And, Shai and I kind of spend this, part of this chapter tracing how these questions get understood over time. So the first wave of implementation of these questions is in a study called the Indianapolis study, which kind of thinks about the question as a question of demographic prediction and control. How good of a measure is it when I ask you how many kids do you want to have? Can you actually predict that number of kids? And the first thing that these scholars do really is try to validate the measure. So they try to prove that there are situations where mothers can successfully say, I want to have 3 kids, and I do have 3 kids. And in part, they're thinking about these questions about demographic transition. Is the birth rate slowing? How can we understand that? But in part, they're also trying to validate a new scientific measure. And so really interestingly, one of the things we find is that the first study is actually limited to upper middle class white women, specifically because they want to hit statistical significance, because they want to prove that the measure is worthwhile. So they want a demographic composition that varies as little as possible, right? And that's a kind of weird way of thinking about scientific objectivity. But that, of course, is what we try to show, is that in this early period, gaps between what you intend, how many children you intend to have, and how many children you actually have, what the demographers call achieved fertility, that gap between your intended fertility and your achieved fertility, at first it's seen as an error, something that science has to find a way to minimize or reduce or control, right? And the measure is always imperfect, because you can't properly predict how many, most of us can't even properly predict what kind of housing we'll live in the future, right? Let alone how many children we'll have. But there is this, forceful effort. And then somewhere around the 1950s, a sudden kind of shift comes in the demographic story, and this is all actually in part funded by Rockefeller Research, which sends a research team out to China, and out there, all these researchers find these mothers who want birth control, but they don't want birth control to limit their family on smaller than cultural numbers, but just to what is the culturally accepted number. So a big family in these communities is 3 children. Mothers don't want birth control so that they can have 1 child. They want birth control so that they can have 3 instead of 5. And for various reasons, this becomes a kind of signal moment in the demography literature in which people start to recognize that the gap between intentions and outcomes, or intentions and achieved fertility, is actually shaped by access to birth control. And throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, as people increasingly are documenting in a large secondary historical literature on fertility control development, the UN, the federal government, huge expenditures are outlaid to both study and promote birth control globally as a means of understanding population dynamics, right? And demographers kind of cast themselves as the natural experts on fertility control and fertility control technologies. And the PAA becomes a center place for all these nonprofits that are working on fertility control globally. And the whole field becomes centered on this idea that no. The gap between intentions and outcomes is not about how good our science is. It's about how involved we are in policy. Because when we're involved in policy, we can help make that gap shrink. We can help give women control over the number of births they have by promoting policy, notably like in what they call the global south, that promotes birth control and new forms of birth control. This generation invents the IUD in the hopes of creating a systematic and stable form of birth control that will help women take control over their reproductive lives. Now, in the 70s and the 80s, this literature again comes under these two kind of fields become kind of opposed, right? There's kind of one side of the literature that says what we need is better measures of fertility intentions, and that will give us a better sense of how to measure this thing, and we can make that measure stronger. There's a kind of another group of people saying no, we need more government funding so that we can support actual fertility control measures like the promotion of birth control. And these two are kind of warring, and it seems like there's sort of no way out until a third group arrives that kind of argues very centrally what we need to take into account are local meanings and local attitudes. And this is partially spurred by the activism of women's health advocates like Bella Abzug, who go to the UN, and at these UN meetings on population control and population development say things like, asking how to control population without asking the mothers themselves is like an insane activity. They publish these articles, these ads in the New York Times of mothers, and it says, who better to understand population control across the world than the mothers who are having the children themselves, right? And this helps launch a whole nother wave that we see up until today, where the fertility literature and the demographic literature on the family is now really centered on how do women understand their fertility choices, their fertility intentions, their birth control options, and how do those local meanings help us to gain a better sense of what actual population policies are worthwhile and which ones are not. And so in this last phase, you see this effort to actually kind of keep both. There's an article we like, or I like a lot, we both like a lot, by Jenny Trinitopoli and Sarah Yeatman, that proposes new measures of flexibility, fertility flexibility, questions about, okay, if I ask you your intentions, let's say you tell me you're going to have 3 children, what happens when I ask you right after, how flexible are you about that number? And it turns out people are really good at telling you whether or not they think they're going to have the number they predict. And so they advocate both expanding the surveys to include flexibility questions, something that we would have seen traditionally under the efficiency repertoire, the first repertoire, the one that saw intentions as a question of measurement. And they also advocate that it allows them to better predict things like take up of contraception, right? That when you say, oh, I'm more flexible, it turns out that you're also like a little more flexible how you use birth control as well. And so that speaks to the concerns of the second group, right? But now it's all kind of reconstituted, reorganized around this new question of what does fertility control mean to mothers? How do mothers experience it? And how can we use that to help further these existing goals of kind of policy, informed demographic policy about population at the global level and demography as a quality science, right? And so we say the field has been reconstituted, it's been rebuilt. And in this way, we do try to argue for kind of hopeful sociology, which is that sociology actually grows by adding moral repertoires, not necessarily jettisoning them entirely.
One of the things you mentioned just as you were talking about that case study was, people should read the book. And I think we've got, a couple of really good in-depth and detailed examples from you both. But I really want to stress, the book is really rich and there are, kind of numerous examples. There's a lot of stuff about cosmopolitanism we've not sort of, talked about or touched on, but even in the case studies we've talked about, there's a lot going on in the book, in addition to what we've had a chance to kind of highlight and showcase in this podcast. To wrap up, I'm quite interested. Maybe I'll come to you, Shai, for the last word. The book is really kind of, and I thought this was really valuable about the book. The book is not kind of saying we've solved this issue and we're going to kind of make a final judgment about how it is sociology should position itself, the moral positions it should take, and how you might kind of solve debates where these moral repertoires come into play. And as we've already heard from both of you, how this might be done in different subfields. And you kind of pull out this idea of value pluralism being really important. And the thing you sort of caution against, even though it's not a final statement, is this idea of avoiding moral myopia. And I wonder, to conclude, could you kind of unpack moral myopia for me and talk about how value pluralism can be useful in the context of what kind of good social science is?
Yeah, so as you say, we're absolutely not making a judgment about which moral repertoires are best. What should sociologists kind of adopt as their moral compass? But we are cautioning against individual sociologists believing that there's only one right repertoire to go with, and that's what we refer to as moral myopia, right? In a sense, thinking, I'm just going to focus on this one kind of way of evaluating sociology, right? Just the facts, just based on the facts, or just based on the civic contribution, and anything else is invalid. And the reason we draw on Isaiah Berlin's notion of value pluralism is because that notion provides us with a view of a society that actually celebrates multiple ways of evaluating what is worthy, what is moral, without falling either into the side of everything goes, basically no moral judgment whatsoever, or to the side of moral myopia, right? Thinking just that there's just one value, and we're also drawing on organizational sociologists like David Stark and on Michelle Amont's work, right, which show us that successful societies and organizations recognize multiple ways of excelling and of valuing worth, and ultimately, if we develop a culture of valuing multiplicity, we will all be better off as a scientific field.
This seems a bit kind of a mean question, given the book you've written is such a sort of kind of programmatic contribution and ranges over so many fields. But where do you go kind of next with this? Are you both going to kind of carry on writing together? Are you going to do more stuff on these questions of morals? I don't know. Certainly, when I finish writing book projects, I'm a bit like, I'm finished with that. Thank you, and I'll do something else entirely different. So yeah, maybe we'll continue with you, Shai, and come to Sam after that. But yeah, what are you doing sort of as your next project following this book?
Yeah, so I have a second archival project which kind of asks similar questions about student controversies, like the campus controversies, um, and how they historically change in terms of the types of like claims for justice that are being promoted. And I'm looking at historical controversies over the last 50 years, where the basic questions, right? You know, how are the ways in which students even thought it's appropriate to make a claim about, you know, another student group, about a political issue on campus, transformed over time. And Sam and I are continuing to collaborate. We have a project on the sociological canon and controversies over that, and several additional projects. Sam, I don't know if you want to
Yeah. I mean,
elaborate.
so yeah, Shai and I, I think Shai and I have talked about this before, which is that this project's a little bit long term for both of us. We're kind of stuck together now. uh, in part because, like I think a large part of the book is that if we could just get people talking more and more about what's moral about what they do, and we could think about that as central to what it is we do, that we could build something usable in terms of like not a program that we design for sociology, but we can have discussions about what is this sociology activity. We'd be better suited and more prepared for, kind of discipline wide discussions about what it is we're up to and why we are organized and do the things we do. And so, I kind of think about the book, and then, yeah, Shai and I are going to write about the canon to think through about this problem more. And so, we'll keep organizing sessions and doing silly things to promote that. And then beyond that, I will be returning to and finishing up my dissertation work on Puritanism in New England. So I'm super interested in how the Puritans claim to be new Israelites, and I study that in great detail. So that's like, to finish up that project, I'm working on a book for that, trying to get that done. And then as that gets going, I'm starting a new project on a more modern variant of the same phenomenon, the Black Hebrew Israelites. And so I'll be trying to do ethnographic fieldwork here in New York with them as time goes on.